Good morning. I'm Louis Freedberg, Executive Director of EdSource.
I'm John Fensterwald, Editor-at-Large at EdSource.
We are very pleased to welcome the two leading candidates for State Superintendent of Public Instruction in California. This is a position that was written into California's first constitution in 1851. It's a nonpartisan race. We are very pleased to have Assemblyman Tony Thurmond, who is a social worker by training, a former city councilman in Richmond and was also on the school board there. He is now in his second term representing his East Bay district. Welcome, Tony Thurmond.
Thank you for having us.
Next to him is Marshall Tuck. Marshall ran a charter school organization in LA and then ran a district-city partnership running several district schools, and also in Los Angeles, and he was most recently an educator in residence at the new Teacher Center. Welcome, Marshall Tuck.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for hosting the conversation.
Well, we are looking forward to a robust discussion, and we've asked the candidates, however, to limit the answers to 1.5 minutes or less. It'll be a challenging assignment, but we're just trying to squeeze in as many questions as possible. Many of you watching have also sent in questions, and we will try to get to some of them during the hour, and we will in any case share the questions with the candidates so they can get a sense of what is on your minds. Despite its longevity in California, not many people know what the Superintendent of Public Instruction actually does. And the office's powers are actually quite limited. So we've asked each of the candidates to make a short opening statement as to why they are running for the post and why they feel they're qualified to run the California Department of Education. So we're going to start with Tony Thurmond.
Thank you. I'm running simply because I believe that every single student can be successful regardless of his or her circumstances. That's been the narrative of my own life, using education to overcome humble beginnings. I'm someone who was raised in the public school system. I lost my only parent to cancer when I was 6 years old, was raised by a cousin who I never met before. And she saved my life, and she made sure I got a great public education. And in spite of those humble beginnings and being raised in a low-income background, being a kid on the free lunch program, education opened doors for me, and it allowed me to become a 20-year social worker and spend 12 years working in schools, become a school board member and a council member, and to help a district see its graduation rates increase and to reduce suspensions. In the legislature, I've made it my priority to bring millions to our schools to help our kids, to reduce chronic absenteeism, and to support important programs like early education, preschool, and improve funding for our schools. These are the kinds of things I want to bring to our state. I want to prepare our students for the jobs of tomorrow. More STEM, more computer science opportunities so our kids can learn about the jobs of tomorrow and be ready. Improve literacy, improve funding, and close our teacher shortage. It's important to elect the superintendent who has a track record of working with the legislature, working with the governor, and getting things done. And this is the record that I bring to this office. I'm honored that we've built a strong coalition of those who support my campaign and who I believe will help us to do the work as we go forward, including the current Superintendent of Public Instruction, Tom Torlakson, both California's teachers and administrations, endorsed by the California Teachers Association, and over 21 superintendents of county offices of education. Our California Democratic Party, California's nurses, California's firefighters, Equality California, and Planned Parenthood. Together, let's create a great opportunity for all of our students to be successful in the state of California.
Thank you, Tony Thurmond. Now, Marshall Tuck, for your opening remarks.
Great. Thanks again for all the work you both do at EdSource and for hosting this conversation. I believe deeply in the promise of public education. I was raised in a household of educators, and the idea that with a quality education, somebody can have a successful life regardless of their circumstances, that is the true promise. But unfortunately, right now in California, that promise is not being fulfilled for all kids. So as we're talking right now, there's 6.2 million kids in public schools in the state of California, and over 3 million can't read and write at grade level. Think about what that means for their future in the most competitive economy in the history of humankind. And we have to ask ourselves the question as Californians, how is it possible that a state with so much money, with so many incredible kids, and so many hardworking educators is not getting the job done in public education? And I believe strongly it's because our state has not prioritized our public schools, and our elected leaders have not gotten the job done when it comes to public education. A lot of people blame educators for what's going on in our public schools, and that's completely wrong. Teachers did not underfund their classrooms. Principals did not smother their schools in red tape. Politicians made these decisions, and that's why we have to change the politics of education. And it starts with electing an educator to be state superintendent and not just another politician. I've worked in education for over 15 years. I helped create a group called the Partnership for Los Angeles Schools. Think of it as a school district within LA Unified, just focused on turning around the lowest performing schools in LA. Our graduation rates were 36% when we started in 2008. They're 81% today. I helped create Green Dot Public Schools, a nonprofit organization opening charter schools in the highest need areas of LA. Helped open 10 new public schools, 8 of 10 recognized by US News and World Report amongst the best public schools in the country. That's what's possible in public education. I work with school districts to put in place high quality coaching and mentoring programs for our teachers. I know what it takes to turn around our public schools because I've done it. More funding for our schools, more compensation and much more support for our teachers, less bureaucracy, more creativity in our classrooms, and truly focusing on all kids. It's time for a leader who's done this work, who's going to drive real change for our kids in our public schools.
Thank you, Marshall Tuck. And I'm going to put the first question to you. A series of reforms are in place right now in California. The Common Core, the local control funding formula, a new accountability system, all loosely defined as the California way. Do you think California's education system is on the right track, or are there major changes that need to be made? And if so, name the most important change that you think needs to happen.
Yeah, I think we absolutely need major change. We're in a state right now where only 1 in 10 African American males that starts high school graduates prepared for college. 1 in 10 in the great state of California. It is absolutely unacceptable. We're in a state right now where we have the largest gap between whites and Latinos in terms of college graduates. 51% for whites, 70% for Latinos. It's an unacceptable difference. And so we absolutely need real change in our schools. That does not mean that there's folks working in our schools that aren't making real progress. We've moved forward on the Common Core. Governor Brown passed the local control funding formula, which said more dollars for higher poverty kids. There is good work to build off of, but without question, we need real change, not more the same. We need educators leading this work, not just politicians. And when we think about the local control funding formula, it's a good example of where politicians aren't getting the job done. So Governor Brown passed this piece of policy, very important piece of policy, more money for high poverty kids. I'm a strong supporter of it. But the reality is, because of an interpretation by the current state superintendent, that money's not actually all getting to the highest poverty kids. And my work has been in Watts, in East LA and South LA, with wonderful students that have real huge opportunities for the future, but we gotta get them better public schools. And we have to make sure every single dollar that is meant for our highest poverty kids gets to our high poverty kids. We gotta make sure that the teachers that are supporting our highest poverty kids get those supports. And we gotta make sure, most importantly, we support our kids.
And so then if there was one change that you think needs to happen?
Well, I think the most immediate change is, certainly as a state, we have to increase our overall funding levels. So we're 41st in per pupil funding. That's something I can't do on my own as state superintendent, but I'll push every day of the week for. A change I can make as state superintendent is to shift the interpretation that was made by the current state superintendent that basically allocated the additional dollars for high poverty schools and allowed that to be used for across the board raises for all educators, regardless if they actually teach high poverty kids or not. So we'll make that change right away.
Okay, let me ask Tony Thurmond. Do you think California is on the right track, or do you think changes are needed? And if so, what would you see as the most important change?
Well, I'd say it's a little bit of both. I think that California has laid a decent foundation with Common Core, with accountability measures, with funding increases, with the local control funding formula, but it is not enough. And I would say that we are closer to being 46th in the nation in per pupil spending. And we've been that way since the 1970s, since Prop 13 passed. We have to close the loopholes in Prop 13 and properly fund education in our state and make education funding #1 for California kids. We've got a huge teacher shortage that we have to close. And I'm working on policies right now that would provide a scholarship to anybody who wants to become a teacher, even a teacher housing bill to build affordable housing for educators. Because we have found that in many of our communities with the highest achievement gaps, teachers simply cannot afford to live in the communities where they work. And if you continue to have a teacher churn, you can't close our achievement gap. The local control funding formula is a great step in the right direction, but it doesn't go far enough. It only takes us to funding at 2008 funding levels, which was a recession. I'm working on policies right now with legislators that would actually expand the base of funding for school districts and would actually provide more funding through the LCFF framework for the school districts that serve the lowest performing students. Throughout my career, I've worked directly with some of the toughest to serve students. And I've taught classes that were in the juvenile camp. I've taught life skills and career trainings and run after school programs and managed a $400 million school district where we've increased our graduation rates and improved test scores for some of the kids who come from some of the toughest backgrounds. This can be done, but we have to provide the funding for our schools. We have to provide great professional development for our educators to make sure they're prepared to support our students.
And so then you mentioned a number of things, but what would you say would be the number one issue? Is it the funding issue, or I guess you also mentioned the teacher shortage, but what would you see as the number one issue?
Well, I think the funding increase gives us the ability to help close our teacher shortage and to provide better professional development for our educators. We know that the best way to close the achievement gap is to provide every educator with great professional development and training and to make sure that they're all prepared to teach kids to support them towards the new standards. That has not happened uniformly in our districts, and consequently, we're 43rd in the nation in third grade reading and third grade math. We should have a literacy campaign to help our kids improve, but we need resources to get that done. And as superintendent, I will champion efforts to help us increase resources for our schools and make our funding number one.
Don?
Do we have to follow up on these questions or no?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess to me the question for Assemblymember Thurmond and for the legislature is, why haven't we done more of this? So, he's been in the legislature for 4 years. We talk about the need for increased funding. Prop 13 was pulled back in 1978, and yet the legislature hasn't made significant gains on increasing funding. I worked in schools, in South LA, East LA. We had shortages of teachers a decade ago. This isn't new. This isn't new stuff. So why haven't we made the big changes that we need to make? There have been some efforts here or there, but why hasn't the legislature and politicians in Sacramento actually made the large-scale changes to solve these problems rather than continually have the same conversations year after year?
Assemblyman Thurmond.
Two things I'd like to say. One is the funding solution that I've talked about requires approval from the voters and requires a campaign to educate voters about how to create what's called a split roll tax so that no homeowner or no senior is going to have to pay more money in taxes, but big commercial property owners who have not paid their fair share of taxes since the 1970s would be asked to pay their fair share. Our kids deserve it. Secondly, since I've been in the legislature, every single year I've been able to help provide more money for schools. My legislation provided $35 million for 30 school districts last year to support programs like reducing chronic absenteeism and to help increase graduation rates. Since I've been in the legislature, we've added almost $500 million in early education. I've introduced legislation that makes it more easy for students to go to college who've been in foster care, to give them scholarships and grants. We've made the first year of community college free. I can't speak for what the legislature did in the 1970s, but I can speak for what I am doing now. And literally, we've provided millions of dollars for our school districts. And as superintendent, I'll champion a campaign to help raise another $5 billion for K-12 education in our state. I think that's a good start to making us number one, and we'll continue until we make our funding number one in the state.
Thank you. Tony, go first. We know there are many outstanding teachers in high poverty schools, but there's compelling data that show more inexperienced teachers are often concentrated in those schools. What can the state superintendent do to ensure that high poverty schools get an equal, if not a larger, share of the most effective teachers?
The way we do professional development in this state has really been mind-boggling to me. Typically, a district will send one teacher representative from a school to a training, and then that teacher is expected to come back and do a turnaround training for everyone else on their own time. I think that really sets us up to have a bad result. And we should be providing upfront professional development for every single educator, especially our new teachers. New teachers should get support around classroom management. They should get great mentoring from senior teachers. This year, I've introduced legislation that will provide just that, mentorship and coaching, especially to teachers in one of our toughest areas, special education. Most of our teachers will tell you that they're burnt out, they feel like they don't get support, the conditions are very difficult, and so we've got to provide mentoring and coaching to our teachers from the time that they start so that they have the right experiences to be successful. This year I've introduced legislation that will provide a scholarship to anyone who wants to become a teacher in areas like special education, computer science, math, the areas where we have struggled. We've got to build a culture that says we support teachers, we coach them, we train them We give them the tools that they need to be successful in the classroom and support our kids. Those are the kinds of things that I'm working on now and I'll continue to work on as superintendent.
Thank you. Marshall?
The promise of public education has to be for all kids. Every kid, every neighborhood in the state of California. And right now, as you mentioned, for high poverty kids, mostly Latino African American students, they get younger teachers that turn over more often, less experienced principals that turn over more often. And if we want quality education for all kids, we have to get sustained, high quality teaching, school leadership for all of our kids. The schools that I led, we paid principals more to come work in Watts and East LA and South LA because they're harder jobs. And you can make more in Watts than you could in the wealthier parts of Los Angeles. We have to do that across the board for higher poverty kids. Jordan High School in South LA, we paid teachers signing bonuses to come work at Jordan High School because that school had such a hard time actually attracting teachers year after year. And if you have substitutes in your classroom, how can you actually learn? We also gave our principals and teachers more supports in the highest poverty schools. So when we had a principal at Roosevelt High School, that principal had a coach and a mentor a day a week to help them do their jobs because they're harder jobs. So we have to actually look at more pay for teachers and principals in the highest poverty neighborhoods and more support and more coaching and training for those teachers. New Teacher Center, which I worked at, our whole focus was get high quality coaches and mentors for teachers in our neediest schools. And until we change that dynamic, until we get high quality, consistent teaching and principals in our highest need schools, we will never close this achievement gap. And as state superintendent, it will be a top priority of mine, and that starts with making sure the additional money that's meant to go to high poverty kids gets to high poverty kids.
Thank you.
Could I ask a question on this? You talk about giving higher pay to principals and teachers. Two questions. One, structurally, how would you do that, recognizing that pay is something that's established at each individual school district level? The state superintendent doesn't have direct influence over that. How would you go about doing that? And then secondly, I would just ask really a values question. Wouldn't it be better just to increase compensation for all of our educators and to say we want everyone to be highly paid, highly trained, highly supported, instead of creating two-tier systems that says we prioritize some educators over others? Give everybody the best resources and the best supports to go train kids. Wouldn't it be a better way to go instead of creating a two-tier system of who gets paid?
So we absolutely have to increase pay for all teachers. Our state, we have a situation where two teachers in their 30s who are married can't buy a house near most places where they work, and that has to change. That's why we have a huge teacher shortage. So I'm a strong believer. We're very transparent about it. We need much more pay, probably 30% more pay for all teachers. But you do have to actually differentiate and pay more for the higher poverty communities because they are harder jobs. It's more emotionally draining. There is a reason that our neediest kids for decades have had younger teachers and principals with more turnover because year after year after year, we've allowed that to happen. And what we need are politicians who aren't just going to say things, but actually people who've been educators who make hard decisions with budgets. If I have limited money and I know that we do not have principals staying in our highest need schools, we have to pay them more and support them better. And then in terms of district by district, ultimately, if we give more money for higher poverty kids, which is what Governor Brown has actually put forward, if we deliver on that bill and say that money actually has to go to the highest poverty school districts, you'll see school districts giving more pay to teachers and principals who are in the most challenging schools. And if we give them more pay plus more support, we will break what I believe is the foundation of this achievement gap, which is we are not giving our neediest kids high quality instruction or high quality leadership. We changed that in the schools I led, which is why we doubled graduation rates. We're going to change that throughout the state.
Thank you. So
You get the redirect on that, redirect?
well, let's move on. We have a lot of
That's a lot of redirect.
It's not court. So Tony's already mentioned the teacher shortage. How would you characterize the teacher shortage? Is it a crisis? Is it selected in certain subjects? And what would you do about it?
So it is an absolute crisis. There's nothing more important to a child's success in a school than the teacher in front of that child. Nothing more important. And if we want to have the best public schools in the country, which we should have, if we want a quality education for every child, which is, I believe, their right, we have to have an incredible investment in our teachers. There's nothing more important. And the fact that this state has allowed us to have a 10,000 teacher shortage, and the fact that politicians have year after year, again, just dabbled on the edges versus addressing this issue with real focus and force, shows you the disconnect in terms of the lack of investment in our public schools. In 2002, when I was running schools in Inglewood, we had a hard time getting math and science teachers to come work in Inglewood in South LA and East LA. This is not a new issue. It has grown. And so it's time for us to get serious about, if we want a great school for all kids, we got to have a wonderful investment in our teachers. And that means we got to pay our teachers more. We got to totally restructure our teacher training programs. The world has changed so much. Our kids have changed a lot, yet our university training programs still are actually not really focusing our teachers on what they need for the future. We need a lot more time for our teachers to work with each other. New Teacher Center where I worked, it was all about finding your most effective teachers and have them be coaches and mentors to other teachers, so we're lifting up the entire profession. We need principals who understand instruction, but most importantly, we have to say the top priority for our kids, quality teacher in every classroom, quality principal in every school. I've done that before my work. That's what we're going to move towards at the state level.
Tony, you touched on teacher shortage. Would you like to elaborate?
I would say that it's at a crisis level, and there are districts where 200 teachers are being replaced every year for 4 years straight. You can't close the achievement gap with that type of churn. We need consistency. The teacher shortage, to me, goes back to 2008 when we had a recession in education and lots of cuts got made to release teachers. I actually opposed those kinds of cuts because I anticipated that we'd be in a situation where we'd be scrambling to bring teachers back. Nonetheless, that's where we are. And then the environment has just become very difficult. Teachers get lower compensation. They get blamed for all the challenges that many of our students are experiencing, and they're not being provided with the right type of training and support. Many teachers tell me that they have not been provided with training to support students towards our current Common Core. We should be working with our teachers to make sure that they're able to support our students for the next generation science standards, for STEM and STEAM. There's going to be 1.5 million jobs in technology in just a few years. We'll only have half the applicants for those jobs unless we do more for our teachers and our students. That's why I've introduced legislation that will give $200 million in professional development in STEM, in computer science, so that we can support our students for the jobs of the future. Let's expand our training programs. And again, I've got a scholarship program that will help anyone who wants to become a teacher, a mentorship program so we can help retain teachers, and a teacher housing program to help address the lack of affordable housing, which has driven many of our educators away from our districts that need them the most.
Thank you. Louis.
So I just want to say, the issue on teachers started well before this recession. I mean, those of us that run schools, we had a hard time getting teachers, particularly in our high poverty neighborhoods, a long time ago. And that's because this state has underfunded schools. It's because school districts don't pay teachers enough. And it's because we haven't really invested in developing and supporting our teachers. So this is not something new. I think that the fact that we all know, everyone who works in school, every parent, we know the most important thing in a school is a teacher. And yet our state has undersupported, underpaid, under-embraced, and frankly over-regulated our teachers and taken creativity and innovation away from them for literally decades, not just for the last 8 years. It's a clear indication of the need for real change in our public schools. The status quo is not working.
Thank you.
I wanted to just ask you about the issue of testing. The latest results, we're waiting for some new ones in a couple of months. The students, millions of students have just finished taking these tests, but the last test things were kind of flat on average. I mean, obviously got a lot of kids doing brilliantly, other kids doing very poorly, but average scores were kind of flat. How concerned should we be about the fact that we haven't seen a big bump in these test scores? And there's been a move not to focus so much on test scores anyway. How concerned are you about those scores?
I think that we should be concerned that our test scores are flat and that there have been some places where there have been improvement, but those have been few and far between. We should work with those districts that have seen improvement in their test scores and figure out what their best practices were and help other districts replicate that. This year I organized a roundtable of statewide educators to look at test scores specifically as it relates to the achievement gap, and to pair districts together to see how they can help each other with best practices that will help those districts whose test scores have remained flat. And as a legislator, I've supported adding money to the budget to provide experts who can provide technical assistance to districts to help them strengthen their plans to close the achievement gap. I appreciate that we are in a spirit where people recognize our kids are more than a test score, but we still have to have measures that let us know whether or not students are meeting the learning objectives and how to compare one student's experience to another. So we have much more work to do. Obviously, we have to do much more work in an early fashion, prevention. I have advocated for more early education and preschool programs And then for our students who are older, more intervention programs. We've got to close our chronic absenteeism gap. We have kids who miss more than 10% of school. It's hard to learn to read by 3rd grade when you've been chronically absent from school. And it costs our schools a lot of money. I've made reducing chronic absenteeism a priority because we can make sure our kids learn to read by 3rd grade so they can read to learn and use that as a skill for their lifetime and bring more money to our schools. I will focus on more literacy programs, literacy intervention, enrichment programs to support our students who need additional support to help raise test scores, and working with districts on their differential programs to help our students who've been identified as having lower scores.
Just quickly, do you think there's too much testing in schools? Do you think we need to be reducing the amount of testing?
I think there are many issues for the low scores. Many teachers have told me that they haven't been trained to support students in the new standards that we are testing for, that they're still teaching kids to memorize data instead of putting a focus on critical thinking and how we get our young people engaged in their community and in teaching civics. I think that we have to increase our involvement there. And it's not just about the test and memorizing the test. We've got to do more around career technical education so our kids can get hands-on experience. We know that many of our students do better when they're in an internship and they have an opportunity to learn about a college and career pathway. And this year I'm advocating for $500 million to be spent in our districts every single year to expand career technical education. I don't think the issue is too much testing. I don't think that we're preparing kids for the test, and that we need to give them more experiences that will help them be successful in the test.
Okay, Marshall Tuck, how concerned should we be about these flat smarter balance, relatively flat?
So we should be very concerned about the proficiency rates of our students. We are in the most competitive economy in the history of humankind. Low-skilled jobs pay poverty wages and nothing else, and over 3 million kids are not at grade level in reading and writing. Their chance at getting a good job in a knowledge-based economy, in a collaborative economy, in a critical thinking economy without strong literacy, their future is ending before it begins. It is a crisis. And then if you break it down in detail, the gaps we have right now between whites and Asians in our schools and Latinos and African Americans, which we made almost no progress on, are startling. Whites, 61%, I believe, at grade level in English. Latinos, 34%. African Americans, I think, is 29%, 27%. 30-point gaps. It is a civil rights issue. It is a crisis. In my opinion, it's a moral issue. And it shows that the system has not gotten the job done. And you think about, should we be concerned? This entire state, both the future of our state, our economy, and the individual futures of every child that's taken away when they're not given a quality education, we got to be very concerned. And so it's time for big change. And it's time for our state to actually prioritize public schools. And we can't just be a little bill here, a little bill there, working on the edges. Like, this state needs to get behind this issue as a top issue in the state. And we can be concerned, but we also can be optimistic. Because I've seen kids, regardless of circumstances and background, have phenomenal success in our schools when we support them. And so I am incredibly optimistic about what's possible. But let's also be straight up about, we have a lot of work to do as a state, and our kids need us to step up for them.
And just quickly, same question. A lot of concern, there's too much testing going on in the schools.
It's interesting, you have some state-mandated tests, and then you have district-mandated tests. So I think some districts have too much testing, and some districts don't. It depends kind of on how, because it's part of a state issue and part of a district issue. I do think that the state needs to get more flexibility around testing so that we're testing smart and not just always testing. So one example is, Long Beach Unified asked the state to be able to just give the SAT test for 11th graders rather than the state required test, because they're giving all their 11th graders the SAT. Makes a ton of sense. Let's have that. Let's have one test for 11th graders rather than two. Two is too much. State didn't accept that waiver when it first started. So I want the state to give much more flexibility to school districts. We shouldn't be over-testing. Smart testing on key subjects to see where kids are at is important, and then also looking at other metrics around graduation rates, around attendance, around absenteeism. We got to look across the board. Most importantly, are we actually preparing our kids for a quality future? And right now, we're not doing it for all kids.
Question, Mr. Tuck. You correctly point out our achievement gap and how African American students and English learners and other students are challenged around test scores. What would you do? What's your vision for how to actually change that in the right direction? I'm talking about things that we are trying, including the last example that you just gave. This year in the legislature, we are giving districts the ability to use the SAT as the standardized test in 11th grade. But what would you do? You've described the problem, which I agree with you, but what's your vision for actually changing it in a positive direction?
Yeah, I mean, the good news is I'm not a career politician. I've been an educator and done the work in schools. And if you look at the partnership schools, which was 15,000 kids, 18 schools in LA, in the lowest performing neighborhoods, we had the highest improvement on state test scores of any school system with more than 10,000 kids during my leadership. And that was with all of our kids were high poverty and Latino and African American, vast majority Latino and some African American. And we did the stuff we know works in schools. We actually got phenomenal principals and teachers to come work in our schools by paying them more and supporting them better. We invested a ton in teacher professional development. We actually got wraparound services. We had a couple high schools where we brought health clinics onto our campuses, so we're really integrating and addressing academic needs plus mental health needs and other health needs. We got our parents more involved. Launched a parent college on Saturdays, 9 a.m. to 1 p.m., where our parents came to learn how to get more involved in their kids' education. We did it all in our kids' store and in our kids' sword, and it started with not accepting the way things were, but actually driving real change to the status quo. And that's what I plan to bring to the legislature and most importantly, the state superintendent position.
Okay, short answer, you asked the question, what's the answer to your own question? What would you do?
As I've said, I would continue to support districts directly to provide them with more resources for better professional development. That's where this all starts. The best way to close the achievement gap is strong professional development for our educators. Prior to that, you do prevention programs, more early education. We have to address the achievement gap before it starts. The achievement gap starts before kindergarten. And we have to have a universal preschool system in this state. And I will work with the next governor to create a universal preschool system in this state. And I'm already starting on that work. This year, I've introduced a bill that taxes private prisons to generate revenue for preschool and after-school programs. One of the things that I think that you'll learn, Mr. Tuck, is that the state budget doesn't allow a superintendent to create a new program unless you generate new revenue. And that's why I asked you a question about what's your vision for creating the revenue needed and for creating the work, because you wouldn't be the superintendent of any individual district. We've got to be in a position to support hundreds of districts throughout the state and the 58 county superintendents. And so my plan is to bring more resources to start preschool programs and to work with our governor and our legislature to have a universal preschool program. And we're starting with that right now by generating more money for early education in our state.
So I think it's appropriate for me to get a chance to respond to that. We talk about pre-K for all, and you talk about it a lot, and yet our state doesn't have it. And it's expensive, but it's not that expensive. We have prioritized other things other than pre-K. Every educator, every parent knows that pre-K makes sense for kids, and yet we have not delivered on it. You've been in the legislature for almost 4 years. It hasn't gotten done. You talk about taxing private prisons. You voted for a substantial raise for correction officers, which is a much larger sum of money towards prisons than any tax on private prisons. If that money had actually been decided to be used for pre-K, we'd have pre-K for all high poverty kids. And so when you think about, running budgets is about prioritization. And we have prioritized increasing the costs in our prisons. Votes have been passed around compensation to do that, and we have not prioritized pre-K for all. And that actually is in the legislature. And we need to change that dynamic and always prioritize our kids first.
Okay, well, thank you. Let's move on to the next topic. And so there was another tragic shooting last week. And what could the state and state superintendent do to help make schools safer? And also along the lines, what could you do to help students feel less frightened and apprehensive? And I think, Marshall, it's your turn to go first.
Yeah, I mean, we have a ton to do, both as someone who's led school systems, who parents, when they think about school, they think first and foremost about safety of their child. Somebody who's a parent of a 6-year-old child who goes to our local public school, when I drop Mason off at school, what's the most important thing is I want him to be safe. And the bottom line right now is we have a lot of work to be done there. So, our state is made real progress on gun control, but we got to keep moving forward. There are still more decisions that we can make politically to ensure that guns are just not getting in the hands of our kids, and there's progress to be made there. We have to address these issues well before they begin. Right now in this state, you not only have seen across this nation school shootings, but suicides are up at the highest rate they've been up. And we got to ask ourselves this question, like, why are young people in such a state where they're taking their own lives at the highest rate, and they're also having these mass shootings? And why aren't we addressing these issues much earlier? And the fact that the state of California has one of the worst ratios of students to counselors in the country, we have almost 800 kids for every counselor, means we're not giving our young people the mental health supports and the social emotional needs to support them around that. So we got to get serious about real deep additional psychologists in campuses, more supports on social emotional, much lower ratio of counselor to kids, so we're addressing these issues early. And then we certainly got to make sure our school buildings and our staff are trained to make sure our kids are safe. But I think the key is our kids are going through some tough times right now. And I think whether it's because of technology and the consistent bullying, we got to figure out what that is. And it starts with getting a lot more social emotional supports on campuses early for our young people.
Thank you.
I'd like to start with this. You know, the president has called for arming all of our teachers with guns. That's exactly the wrong thing to do. Our teachers don't need guns. They need resources to educate our kids. They need elected officials who will support real gun control policies to keep guns out of our schools. And, you know, just recently we voted to make a stronger restraining order program that makes it possible for educators to report someone who they think might be at risk for bringing a gun into a school. I've supported legislation that would expand community resource officers and school resource officers to be in our schools, to keep our schools safe, because as a parent of a public school student, I've been called by my child who says there's a gun on campus or someone's retaliating because of something that occurred in the community. And when that happens, you want there to be a trained school resource officer who can work to keep your schools safe. I have legislation this year that will provide more counselors in our schools, more nurses, more psychologists, and more social workers to address direct mental health needs in our schools. We have to address the stigma around mental health and provide more resources for our students and their families. And I've been working for the last year to bring violence prevention trainings into our school districts to help our districts prepare for, to identify risk situations and for what to do in those situations. Clearly, we still have a lot more to do, but this is the work that is already underway, that I'm already working on, and we'll continue to make sure that our teachers have the resources they need to educate kids, that we provide the mental health resources to support our students, and make sure our districts get training on what to do and how to prevent potentially tragic situations from occurring.
Wanted to move on to some of the financial backing that both of you are getting. I think this race, and interestingly, the gubernatorial race, similar issues are being raised as kind of a pro-charter versus anti-charter kind of discussion. More complicated than that. Marshall Tuck, you've been endorsed by the California Charter School Association, millions of dollars of pro-charter money going into independent expenditure committees. Tony Thurmond, you've been endorsed by the California Teachers Association, which has a rigorous campaign, Kids Not Profits, raising the issues about all the money from billionaires going into charter schools. I guess we'll start with you. What do you think will be expected of you from your supporters, the California Teachers Association, and will you be independent of those forces? In other words, why are they putting all this money to support you?
Well, let me just start with the last part of your question. Yes, I'll be independent, and that's what I have demonstrated in 11 years of being elected. And I'm glad to have support from teachers. I'm also supported by a broad array of groups, including 21 county superintendents. But I always tell people, support doesn't mean that you're going to vote for everything that any group has asked. And if you look at my record, you'll see that I have differed on major policy issues from the teachers union. I am not a candidate who fits in anyone's box. My only job is to do what's in the best interest of all of our kids. Quite frankly, all this money that's being spent by outside groups, I wish they put it all towards helping our kids. If you look at how much was spent in the last superintendent race 4 years ago by outside groups, that's a huge amount of money that could have supported any one of the challenges that we've talked about here today. I've made this a campaign that's focused on issues and focused on helping our kids. Every decision that I make will be focused on the lens of what is best for our kids. I'm glad to build partnerships, but I will work with everyone, groups that support me, groups that don't. We'll bring together the Education Coalition to talk about all the big challenges that we need to address, dealing with pension reform, closing our achievement gap, closing our teacher shortage, working with parents and educators to figure out how we strengthen our accountability measures so that they're more usable for our families. We'll build a strong coalition, and at the end of the day, I'm going to be independent as I've demonstrated in my career, and I'll do what's best for kids.
Marshall Tuck, a lot of money coming from people who really believe very strongly in charter schools. What are they expecting from you, and will you be independent as superintendent of public instruction?
Yes, so for our campaign in terms of independence, I mean, I believe I'm the first candidate for state superintendent, potentially ever, who is taking no money from PACs or corporations. So we are only taking money
That's
from
direct
individuals.
Contributions to
Yeah,
your campaign.
absolutely. So only taking money from individuals, and we have over, I think, around 2,500 supporters. And you mentioned the California Charter Schools Association has endorsed our campaign, and we have some supporters who support nonprofit charter schools. Also, ACSA, the Association of California School Administrators, the group that represents all of the principals and superintendents and administrators in traditional public schools in the state, has endorsed our campaign. We have a lot of Democrats who have supported our campaign. We got Republicans. We have independents and libertarians. The one common bond between our supporters, they know we need real change in our public schools. They know that the status quo is not working, and they look at my track record as somebody who's actually delivered real results for kids in our schools, the majority of that time in district public schools, some of that time in nonprofit charters. They know that our kids deserve better in the state of California, and I want as wide of a tent as possible, people from all income levels, all backgrounds, to get behind what is essential, which is our kids' future, and get this state on the right track where it is truly prioritizing all kids.
John, you want to follow up about some issues on charter schools?
Yeah.
So let's just talk a little bit about some of the issues that are on the table right now regarding charter schools.
Yeah, Marshall, go first. What's your overall assessment of charter schools, their effectiveness and performance, and some of those who have given to an independent expenditure would like to see a majority of students in charter schools. So, what's your view? And you can keep it concise because we've got several questions on charters.
Okay. We'll do our best. So I think that too often this question comes up of like charter versus district public school. And I think the right question for policymakers is, how do we deliver a quality public school for all kids, whether it's a traditional district school, a magnet school, or a charter school? I've worked in nonprofit charter schools. I've worked for a longer period of time in district public schools. The vast majority of kids in our public schools go to district public schools. That's where the focus needs to be. I don't believe that charter schools should be a majority of kids in public schools. I think that nonprofit charter schools, particularly in high poverty areas where the system has failed our kids year after year, I think having another public school option is a good thing. Wealthier families have always had the option to go to a different public school. They've never been stuck in failing schools like a lot of kids I work with in Inglewood and Watson, South LA. So the idea of having an alternative option, as long as it's doing well, is good. Now, I've worked in both charters and district schools, so I think the ability to answer the question about like, hey, what policies make the most sense to have charter schools be a part of a public education system, but not the majority of it. Charter schools that aren't doing well should be shut down. Charter school law was passed in 1992. It's time to actually look at it and change it, because we've got some schools that aren't working, and those ones should be shut down. We certainly should ban for-profit charter schools in the state of California. The fact that it hasn't been banned yet shows you just some of the failures in Sacramento, because the majority of people actually agree it makes sense not to have them. So we've got to get focused, but I think we always got to come back to the first question. What does a parent of a child care about? They want a quality public school that is safe, and the governance structure is not their top priority. They want to help their kids get better.
Tony, your overall assessment of charters.
My overall assessment and the data suggests that charter school experiences, by and large, similar to traditional public school experiences, are about the same. There are some examples, though, that are different, and there are some real bad actors, and I would agree that we should be banning for-profit charter schools. And I'm supporting legislation this year that will ban for-profit charter schools. There have been some that have had just egregious actions and have profited and have not served students well. At the same time, there are some charter schools that have done things that are really good and innovative that we should be looking to replicate in traditional public schools. I had a chance to visit a number of schools this year, and I would shout out a couple. Fortune Charter Schools, which supports African American students and has come up with some great innovations. Making Waves Academy. Had a chance to visit with some great students from my district. And Leadership Public Schools in Richmond, where we actually built a state-of-the-art high school to support that charter school and a traditional public high school on the same campus. I think that many of these schools have demonstrated some innovations that should be replicated, but I think overall the experience of charter schools has been one where it is about the same as our traditional public schools.
So it's possible that the next legislature may choose to amend the current charter law based on some of the issues being raised this year. So wondering if you could take just 30 seconds as I go through several possibilities and tell me whether you favor it or not. Tony, would you favor a moratorium on charter schools? If so, on what grounds?
I haven't called for a moratorium on charter schools. I do think that there is a challenge around the resource question. I have been very public in saying I don't think that we should open any new schools without providing new resources to support that school. I think the way things are now, and the data shows this, that for every school that opens without new resources, there is an impact on the schools in the district that that charter will be based in. And so I think that we should be having a different conversation. Maybe the conversation is more of a pause than a moratorium, to give us a chance to figure out how we can open new schools and provide the resources for that school in a way that don't necessarily have to impact or undermine another school.
Thank you. Marshall, moratorium?
Yeah, I don't support a blanket moratorium on charter schools, because that would be taking an important tool out of the toolkit to deliver on what is our responsibility to parents, which is a quality public school for all kids. I think about, I live in Los Angeles, KIPP Los Angeles, their elementary schools serving all high poverty kids outperform 93% of elementary schools in the state of California. And they're serving almost all high poverty kids. If they want to open another couple elementary schools, let's let that happen, because I'm pretty confident parents will want to go to that school. Now, that being said, there are unintended consequences that we have to look at and make some adjustments to the charter policy to ensure that we're only actually growing quality charter schools, and the ones that aren't effective should be shut down. But a blanket moratorium doesn't make sense for parents or kids.
Can I ask a question?
Let's just ask another question on this, sort of dancing around this issue. Should school boards be permitted to cite what they judge to be a negative financial impact on their district as a reason to deny a charter? And that bill will likely come up next year. And Tony, what do you think?
Well, that is not the law. The law says that a charter has to be approved based on the program that they offer for students. And as a school board member, I've authorized charters, I've renewed charters. And when there's a strong program, you have to follow the law. I do think that the real issue that those proponents who brought forward that legislation are saying is you do have to look at the undeniable impact that the opening of new schools without resources has had on many traditional public schools. If you look at the Oakland School District, which has 40 charter schools, it was recently reported some figure upwards of $50 million is lost just from the opening of those schools. These issues do have to be addressed, and we should.
And I appreciate it's not the law now, but if you can give a yes or no, if there's a bill next year that says, yeah, let's make fiscal impact one of the criteria for denying or approving a charter, is that a good idea?
I'm going to say that I would support legislation that changes the narrative to say, let's not open any new schools without providing resources for those schools. Because there's no question that opening schools without new resources has had huge impacts on our traditional public schools.
Thank you. Marshall?
Yeah, I don't think a school district should be able to reject a quality charter school application, particularly from someone who's proven to deliver results, based because it may have some negative financial impact on the district. I don't think that's a good policy for kids and parents. I do think we have to look at other policies, places like LA or Oakland, where they've had large number of charter schools grow. Maybe extend the hold harmless policy, where you give the district some additional resources to make some adjustments on the cost structure if it is losing kids in terms of enrollment. Extend that for a couple years to make that transition for districts and most importantly for kids more effectively. But I think a straight allowing districts to just say, hey, financial impact, no to a quality charter, I think is not the right thing for the parents and kids we serve. I mean, the question always comes back to, what are we doing to give every kid a quality education? And I don't think that moves us forward on answering that question.
Okay, thank you.
We have to move on, but just to clarify, you said perhaps there should be a pause. Should there be or shouldn't there be?
I've often asked this question to leaders at the Charter School Association. What is the tipping point of how many schools you can open? Meaning you can't open enough schools to serve all of the students who have need. And if opening new schools without new resources to go with them has
charter schools.
correct,
Charter schools.
correct. Without providing the resources, it does have an impact on traditional public schools. And I think it is worth asking the question, how do we address these issues? How do we give parents choices without undermining the impact, the experiences of students who won't have the chance to attend that charter school? I could support a pause conversation to look at resources, but I'm not going to blanket say that there should be no more new charters. If someone's going to open a charter school to serve African American students or a science school for girls, for places where we've had inequities, there may be compelling reasons for why to do that. But we have got to answer the question of how we will address the resources. And I don't support opening new schools without providing resources for those schools and just taking away resources from the schools that they will be based nearby.
Go ahead.
Wanted to move to another topic. We have this new system in California, the California School Dashboard. I'm sure many of you out there have seen it. Color-coded, multiple measures. Do you think the dashboard is working? Do you think this actually is telling parents and other people who want to know what's going on in these schools how things are going?
I do. I like the dashboard. I think it recognizes that our students are more than a test school. It gives parents a way to understand the full performance of a school by looking at things like school climate and how English learners do and how we engage parents. I also understand that there are some who feel that it has made it harder, that the dashboard makes it harder for a parent to really know how a school performs. And I think if that's the case, I think that there's an opportunity to adjust the dashboard and to make some changes that will make it easier for parents to compare one school to another. I don't think that the dashboard should be a way to hide how a school is really doing. And I think the best way for us to strengthen the dashboard is to get input from the most important end user, parents and families. And as superintendent, I would invite our parent clubs and our PTAs and parent groups across the state to work with us to give feedback on ways to make the dashboard more user-friendly.
Marshall Tuck, California School Dashboard.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all know schools work better when parents are involved, and it's better for our kids. And that's why in the school systems I've led, we really embraced engaging parents. That's why my wife and I try to, when we have time, engage with our son's school. And so when we think about a school dashboard, which is really information for both parents and also for educators, the question is it helping us to engage parents more? And I think that there's real improvements to be made with the dashboard because it's not extremely user-friendly for parents. I've gone on to the website and looked at the dashboard for my son's school, and I'm pretty knowledgeable in education, and it's just not the easiest user-friendly tool in terms of really getting a sense of what's going on at the school. I think that the move on the dashboard to what's called multiple measures, where we're looking at not just test scores, but also looking at rates of redesignation for English learners, where we're looking at chronic absenteeism. Moving to multiple measures is a good thing for the state. We did that in our schools for a long period of time, but we have to remember that if it doesn't work well for parents, then it's going to not have them be as involved. And so I think there's real work to be done to improve the dashboard from where it is, so it's much more user-friendly for parents, and also actually improve it so it's better for teachers to be able to, and principals to be able to see how are their schools performing compared to other schools so they can learn from other quality practices in our public schools. We need information, but it's got to work for those that are most important to our kids' success, which is our parents and our teachers and our principals.
So, Marshall, how would you strike the balance between the desire of many student and parent advocacy groups to switch to less punitive approaches to school discipline like restorative justice with the view of some teachers and parents that classrooms are becoming more disruptive? And do you believe in restorative justice?
Yeah, so I'm a strong supporter of restorative justice, and that's the idea that let's actually, when we have incidents arise on campuses, let's actually deal with the root issues of what's going on rather than just punish our kids. We have to address the academic needs of our students. We have to address the social emotional needs of our students. We have to understand where our kids coming from in terms of their communities and their cultures, and we have to do all that to best educate our kids. In our schools in LA, and I'm really proud of Joan Sullivan, who's now running the partnership schools after Everlast, we're a leader on restorative justice in terms of what we put into place in our schools. And we actually have restorative justice coordinators in many of our schools and recognized in LA as leaders in that area. And what you see is our kids have more success when we're actually bringing kids together to resolve conflict. when we're actually giving kids space to talk about where are they coming from to start their day and what's going on in their lives, they feel better, and it prepares them more effectively, one, to do their work, and it really reinforces their desire not to engage in destructive or inappropriate behavior going forward. You certainly have to have a balance in terms of some accountability and discipline, but our balance has been way too far on accountability and discipline for our kids and not enough on really addressing the social emotional needs, really understanding what's going on and why are conflicts happening. And the more we teach our kids that when they're younger, then you're going to see more and more understanding behavior and less conflict and acting out behavior. And that's what our young people need.
Tony.
I believe in restorative justice, and as a school board member, I led an effort to reduce suspensions using restorative justice, and we reduced our suspensions by 27% in 1 year. But that meant that all teachers had to get training in restorative justice. I think it's a mistake to ever say, we're going to do this without providing the actual training in how restorative justice works. My bill, AB 1014, gave $35 million to 30 school districts last year and said that one of the things that they could use those dollars for is restorative justice. And so I believe in it. I think that we can continue to grow it. I think the key is many of our schools don't have a strong program for how to manage student discipline. And the mistake that some schools have made is to use school resource officers as the dean or the disciplinarian, and that is a misuse of that position. It is a position that criminalizes kids instead of recognizing that kids are kids and they're going to do things, and that we have to have structures and programs to do that. And sometimes it's as simple as having an assistant principal or someone who's designated to meet those functions, because teachers cannot be teacher and the disciplinarian at the school. And I'll work with our districts to expand restorative justice through the funding in AB 1014 and other programs, and work with our students. Our students have great ideas on how to make our schools safer. They often are part of conflict mediation programs. I passed a bill that the governor signed that allows a student to be on a school board, a voting school board member in every district in our state. We should listen to our student leaders, we should work with them, and allow them to help us make our campuses safer.
Thank you. Louis.
We're running out of time, but I did want to get in one more question. Then you're going to have a chance to ask your opponent the question. But I just wanted to get back to this funding issue, because the way things are shaping up is likely that you guys will actually be running after the June 5th primary, and that there are going to be many months of debates. But there's also going to be a lot of money going to be going to your campaigns, into these independent expenditure committees, which is vastly exceed the money that are going to direct contributions to your campaign. And you could see how voters would be confused if all these so-called special interests are supporting you and you are claiming you are independent. So how do you feel about these independent expenditure committees, which are not supposed to coordinate with your campaign at all, but there are these interest groups? I want to ask you also, Marshall, about because this is a fundamental part of our election system here.
We need election reform. I support publicly funded campaigns. As someone who doesn't have any money, who doesn't come from any money, who's not connected to any political family, every campaign I've ever run and won was a grassroots campaign, knocking on doors and talking to voters. And those are the kind of things that I love to do. And I'm honored that the voters have allowed me to serve them for over 11 years in that way. I think we should get rid of independent expenditure committees. And I have supported legislation that has passed that creates more accountability of expenditure committees, independent expenditure committees, so that we know where these sources are coming from and who these individuals are. And as I've said, if you look at the $20+ million that they spent in this election 4 years ago, that money should have been put towards supporting our students, supporting our educators, and supporting our schools. I have routinely campaign to create a publicly financed election system so that there are no dollars in campaigns, but I've also been really clear that I will not accept any money from tobacco or from the oil industry or any of these industries that have had negative impacts in our community. I've accepted that pledge to be a progressive campaigner. I have a 100% voting record with the Sierra Club, which has endorsed me, and And I'm honored that the Courage Campaign and other groups have recognized my efforts to try and get money out of politics.
Marshall Tack.
Yeah, I think we're aligned. I mean, campaign finance is broken, and special interests have way, way too much influence over campaigns, and we need to completely reform campaign finance. And there really shouldn't be independent expenditures that can go and run their own campaigns. I mean, if you think about, my wife and I and our son, like we've made a lot of sacrifices to run for office. My wife's incredible, and we're not independently wealthy. We're running nonstop, and then all of a sudden, outside interests who aren't connected to the campaign can just run ads and send messages and spread the word. Those are the rules that are set in this state and this country. They need to be changed. I think we have to really look at public financing of our campaigns, because having limits for candidates and having outside groups that can just do whatever they want, it's just not good for voters, and it really gives special interests too much of a toehold. But I also think about that I can't control. What I can control as a candidate is I am taking no money from companies or PACs. We're taking money from individuals to kind of really push an independence. What I can control is making sure that when we communicate with voters, we talk about what they care about, how we're going to change the lives of our kids, and how we're going to drive real change. So there's just, we have real work to do on changing campaign finance in this state and in this country. It's going to probably require a Supreme Court change, but at a minimum, let's get people voting for Congress and making sure we have the right leadership nationally and the right leadership statewide that has the power to make some of these changes. Because I think Tony and I probably both agree. It's just, as a candidate, we're putting our heart and soul in these campaigns, and it doesn't make sense that the other folks can kind of drive a lot of the destiny.
Quick question?
So,
You can use your question. John, you want to?
yeah, the two of you have not been shy in asking each other questions this morning. We appreciate that. But I wanted to give you one last opportunity to ask the other a question on a topic either we haven't covered or something about their campaign that you're curious about. So, Tony, why don't you?
Well, I'll stick with the same theme we just talked about. Mr. Tuck, you and I have both said that we would campaign against President Trump and Secretary DeVos and their desire to take money away from California's public education system. But you have received money from individuals who support the president and who have campaigned against gay marriage. You have appeared on mailers, next to Donald Trump's major supporters, and I don't see any evidence of you disavowing, those folks like John Cox, who has been endorsed by Donald Trump, and Newt Gingrich, and others who, have espoused the type of idealism that would really hurt California education. I guess I'd ask you, when will you disavow these interests from the Republican Party and other places that you are receiving support from, if you are still opposed to Secretary DeVos and Trump, say so, and if not, are you aligned with them, or are you just going to accept tacit support from them without speaking out against the mean-spirited actions that they are bringing against California students?
Yeah, so I think this is a perfect example of a politician doing politics as usual. And I think, frankly, it's also one of the problems in our society right now, where using misinformation and trying to infuse doubt into people's thinking by throwing things that are inaccurate is a tactic that's being used way too much in D.C. and certainly shouldn't be used on this campaign. And the fact that you're talking about Trump and using similar tactics of misinformation and misguided information. The fact is, here's the record. I actually pushed very hard for Hillary Clinton to be successful, both in terms of donating and actually helping to raise money. I've been very clear. My agenda is strongly against the Trump-DeVos agenda, and you don't have to just take my word for it. President Obama's Education Secretary, Arne Duncan, has endorsed our campaign. And he endorsed our campaign because our agenda is very aligned with their agenda from President Obama. Former congressional member George Miller, Democratic congressional member who was the chair of the Education and Labor Committee for a long time, has endorsed our campaign. Dr. Shirley Weber, deep advocate in this state for civil rights for our kids. All of us are very aligned in our opposition to the current administration and their agenda on education. There is tons of evidence of that. And yet again, another political trick from a politician using misinformation to sow doubt. So I just encourage people to not listen to what a status quo says, which is, let's not focus on the real issues, which are the fact that our kids are not getting the job done, that our politicians haven't gotten the job done. and let's focus on misinformation. Let's all focus on the real facts, which is we need to do a lot better for our young people, and that's what I'll be doing.
Thank you, Tone. Marshall, ask a question.
Yeah, so for Senator Thurmond, you've been on the record saying that the low control funding formula, that you support that the dollars need to follow the kids. And yet you've introduced no legislation to actually change that. And I think it's really one of the biggest problems with that law right now is that an interpretation was made by the current state superintendent to allow that money to be used for across-the-board raises, irrespective if someone actually teaches high-poverty kids or not. You said publicly that you aren't supportive of that, but a simple piece of legislation could actually change that interpretation. So how can you be supportive of money going to the highest poverty kids, which is essential to educate all kids, but not do anything about it?
Thanks for the question. It actually gives me an opportunity to talk about two important pieces of legislation that I am authoring that would actually make sure that the money follows the highest poverty kids, and I hope that you'll support it. The first is a bill that I'm a co-author with Assemblymember Weber that says that we create a framework in LCFF to make sure that dollars go to the lowest performing students in our state. Secondly, I'm supporting legislation. I'm also an author of this legislation that would increase the base for education in our state. And so much to your question, I actually have introduced legislation that will support more funding going to kids who come from disadvantaged backgrounds and our highest poverty kids in our highest poverty districts. And I hope that you'll support it. I hope that those who are viewing today will support it. And I hope that the governor will sign it and to give us more resources for our kids.
Did you support overruling Torgson's interpretation?
I've been very clear that I think that LCFF dollars should be used for English learners and disadvantaged students. I've made that public, and I'll continue to say so.
Thank you. Wish we had more time. Yeah. Time has gone quickly. So I wanted to give each of you 30 seconds to just sort of sum up why it is voters should vote for you. And I guess Marshall will go first.
Yeah, man, you know, what's exciting for someone who's worked in schools for 16 years is I'm just inspired every day by what's possible for our young people. You know, I've just seen our kids from some of the most challenging circumstances just in the thousands step up and we support them. And so we need to support them. And the bottom line is our state has not prioritized them for a long time. And I think that the decision in this election is very clear. And the San Jose Mercury News, I think, said it very clear when they endorsed our campaign. They said it is a choice between a status quo candidate in Tony Thurmond or a change advocate in Marshall Tuck. That's what they actually pushed out there. And so I think if you want real change for our public schools, I hope you'll be a part of our campaign that's going to truly do what our kids deserve, which is give them all a phenomenal education.
Tony, you get the final word.
Thank you for today. I refuse to accept that we cannot provide a great education for all of our kids. I'm told on a regular basis that we should just select the kids who show promise and focus on them. If that were the case, I wouldn't be here to the school programs, teaching life skills and career training, teaching kids who are in the juvenile justice system, and having real results of increasing graduation rates, increasing test scores, and providing millions of dollars to support our education. We can make California's education number one. I hope you'll check out my webpage, TonyThurmond.com. Together, let's serve all of our 6 million students in the state of California.
Well, thank you so much. As we suspected, we didn't get to many of the questions that those of you out there called in or sent us, but we will pass them on to the candidates so they can hear what's on their minds. I want to thank Marshall Tuck and Tony Thurmond for appearing in what will be their last joint public appearance before the June 5th primary. If neither of you get an outright majority, we'll invite you back before the November runoff.
Let's let June 5th happen before you.
Right?
Don't jinx us.
There are 2 other candidates.
We got real work to do to get through June 5th, so let's not go crazy.
Standing invitation.
Well said.
But what I was going to say is next time we're just going to let you guys talk. It's actually refreshing to see the candidates actually communicating with each other and have real dialogue. So we appreciate that. For more news on this race and the campaign for governor, which some of these same issues are being discussed, please come back to EdSource to make it easy to keep up on education news in California from pre-K through college. Subscribe to our daily news digest and our weekly podcast, This Week in California Education. I'm Louis Freedberg with John Fensterwald, and everyone at EdSource, thank you for joining us.